So to start out, I want you guys to think back over 100 years ago to the turn of the century in the Silver Valley in Wallace. The Silver Valley was booming, the mining industry was going fantastic, the trains had come into town, so people were arriving just en masse. We all know the Silver Valley was kind of a wild place, and Wallace was no exception, but Wallace was also built on that wealthy mine money. So it had just been rebuilt, actually, following the 1890 fire when most of the town burned. And so as we think about Wallace over 100 years ago, right there around the turn of the century, just kind of picture what you think that would look like. Think about photography at the turn of the century. So photography back then wasn't nearly as simple as it is today. They didn't have these fancy little devices that we all carry in our pockets that make us all a photographer now. Taking photographs 100 years ago, or 140 years ago, was a very time-consuming process. It required a lot of skill and training. You had to have the right equipment, and it was a lot of hard work. It was very meticulous. It was a tedious process to develop the photos, and if you didn't do it right, they didn't work at all. So thanks to photographers like Nellie Stockbridge, we don't have to imagine what the Silver Valley looked like at the turn of the century. We know. And so today, I want to start by talking about the Barnard Studio and how it kind of got its beginnings. And then Nellie Stockbridge, the woman behind the majority of the Barnard Studios collection. And then I have taken, as Courtney mentioned, some then and now photos so we can compare kind of, Nellie's photos to modern photos and see what has changed in Wallace, or more likely what hasn't changed. And I learned that not a lot changes in Wallace. And then I want to talk about the legacy of Nellie's photo collection and Nellie in the Silver Valley. So to get started, this gentleman here is Thomas Nathan Barnard. He left his home in the Midwest for Montana in 1881 as a young man, where he became an apprentice in the photography trade. Following his time in Montana, he bounced around the West to various mining towns, continuing to learn photography, before he settled in the Coeur d'Alene Mining District in 1886. He arrived in the district on horseback, which I just thought was a fun fact that I pulled out of the newspaper. He came in early enough that he had to arrive on horse and not by train. When he came to the Coeur d'Alene Mining District, he started his photography business in Eagle, which is just down the road from Murray, where silver was discovered, or gold was discovered originally, the first big mining boom to the area. And then after a little while, he ended up in Murray. So he set up a studio in Murray up on the hill above town, and that is Murray in 1886. So that's most likely what it looked like when Barnard came to town. So as mining died down in Murray, he continued to follow the mining action through the Silver Valley. So he ended up in Wardner after silver was discovered there. He stayed in Wardner for a few years before he moved to Wallace in 1889. So from 1889 to 1906, he operated the Barnard Studio out of a building that was located where the post office sits now in Wallace before moving to its final location on Cedar Street. And he was also elected mayor of Wallace in 1898. So when he was elected mayor of Wallace, that is when Nellie comes into our story. So this is Nellie Jane Stockbridge. She was born March 19th, 1868 in Pana, Illinois. She I said I'm nervous. She was the second of 6 children. She grew up in a comfortable home, but her parents taught her to be very frugal and hardworking. So they were comfortable, but they didn't have a lot of money for extra frills. When Nellie was in high school, her father's eyesight began to decline and fail. And so at that point in her life, it became very important to her family for the older children to become independent very quickly. So she had to get a job at a very early age, and this is, starting at that early age is where we see that hard work that her parents instilled in her. We see it starting there, and we see it throughout the rest of her career. But her first experience working was in a millinery shop. This is a really hard word to say. I've been practicing it all day, too. It was a hat-making shop, is what it was. Nellie found the work to be pretty tedious, and from what I read, she didn't really enjoy it, but she did it because she needed to. But while she was working at that hat-making shop, she was offered the chance to learn photographic retouching. while she was at a choir practice. So she jumped at the opportunity. She was very excited about it. And as she was learning photographic retouching, her great aunt Emily passed away. Her great aunt left her a legacy of $100. So Nellie, being the hard worker that she was and being frugal, saw that as an opportunity to invest in her career and in her future. And she moved to Chicago, where she took photography lessons and learned to be a fully trained photographer. I did think this was a really interesting fact that I pulled out of the Mining Town book over here. It's one of the best books about the Silver Valley and Nellie herself, the Barnard Studio. But in that book, it said that at least one of every 4 professional photographers in the United States was a woman at the time Stockbridge received her training in Chicago. So that's a really, really high ratio for any profession at that time to be female. But the book also points out that some of the reasoning for that is probably that photographic retouching was a really, really tedious job, and women were more willing to do it at a lower rate. So it was a job that women were preferred for. In 1898, remember, that's when Thomas Barnard became the mayor of Wallace. He quickly realized that his civic and political activities, along with his mining activities — he was investing in a lot of the mining in the valley — were taking up too much of his time, and he needed help running the studio. So at this point, he was talking to the Reverend Henry Black in Wallace, and he told the Reverend his problem. And it turns out the Reverend's wife, Claire, and her sister Grace had a sister in Chicago who was a professionally trained photographer. So Barnard knew that it would be hard to find a professionally trained photographer in rural North Idaho in 1898. So he jumped at the chance to hire Nellie. So he sent her a telegram to Chicago offering her the job, which she accepted very quickly. And she arrived in Wallace on November 7th, 1898. So she was 30 years old when she arrived in town. And as we see here, at 30, Nellie Stockbridge was slim, small, and bespectacled. Her hair knotted close to her head. I think it's funny, this is a picture of Nellie later in life, obviously, than 30, but that description still fits her perfectly. So she didn't change a lot. When she first arrived in Wallace, Nellie just worked as a photo retoucher in Barnard's studio, but she very quickly proved her worth in the studio. So she hadn't been in Wallace for very long before an article ran in the paper stating that henceforth Miss Stockbridge will be in complete charge of T.N. Barnard's. So it didn't take long before Nellie was in charge of the studio and the photography. In 1907, Barnard sold 1/4 interest in the business to Nellie. And then in 1908, his energy began to ebb. He was starting to slow down, so he ended up moving to Spokane and then moving to California a few years later, where he passed away in 1916. By the time he passed away from tuberculosis, Nellie was perfectly capable of taking over the business, as she had already been running it at that point. But she did continue running it under Barnard's name because it was already such a well-established name and it was easily recognized as a quality photo studio. So Nellie did run it, but it was still called Barnard Studio. So Nellie photographed so many different things and so many different aspects of Silver Valley history. I've pulled out a few here that I want to talk about. So I found an article from 1958 in the Show News Press where they were interviewing Nellie Stockbridge about her time in the Silver Valley. And it said in that article that the Great Fire of 1910 stands out in her memory as the most terrifying experience she has had. She remembers that the opinion of the residents of this city was that the Holocaust would never reach Wallace. She recalls when the wind carried embers into town, how one landed on the old Wallace Times building and it went up like a matchbox. Nellie luckily was able to escape Wallace on a train and headed into Kellogg for the duration of the fire. And when she came back into Wallace, about a third of the town burned in the fire, a third of the buildings, but luckily Barnard's studio was not one of them. So her studio was still standing and we didn't lose that treasure trove of history that they had in negatives at the studio at that time. So that article also said that Barnard's studio has the finest collection of pictures taken before and after the fire in existence. So we're very lucky to have those. Yeah. Another thing that Nellie took a lot of pictures of were studio portraits, like this one here on the right. I just picked this one at random because I thought it was funny they posed with their bicycles. But if you go through her collection, there's thousands of studio portraits. Studio portraits were really the bread and butter of small rural photography studios at that time. It's where they made their money. It's what generated cash flow for the studio. So Nellie, she did a lot of studio photography because, the miners and the people in the valley liked to have photos taken to send back to family and friends that maybe hadn't come west with them. But according to the, within Nellie's full collection of those 200,000 photos, there are over 33,000 images that were taken as studio portraits. So if you had a family member living in Wallace while Nellie was there, it is very likely that there is a photo of them in that collection if you want to look for it. But according to the Barnard Stockbridge Museum's website, there is even discussion that she may have been the best portrait photographer in the 20th century. Why? As an example, she took a portrait of Thomas Barnard, so we'll just go back, this one right here, when he was the mayor of Wallace, in a pose that has the mayor sitting sideways on an armchair, cigar in hand, foot over armrest, and reading a newspaper. Her intent for this unusual pose is believed to be the desire to show a person with class and authority, but at the same time whimsical and approachable. So, I think she was successful. Move back. Nellie photographed, as Courtney said, the inner workings of the mines. She photographed massive events like the avalanches that happened up Burke. She photographed the aftermath of the 1910 fire, but she also photographed little events like local parades. I love all the kids with their dogs. She photographed automobile accidents for insurance claims. So there's a lot of photos of car wrecks in her collection. And she photographed really important dates in Silver Valley history, like when Teddy Roosevelt came to town in 1903. So we really have a treasure trove of history because of Nellie. So, newspapers throughout Nellie's life, and even following, tended to portray Nellie as an adventurous, riding wild all through North Idaho to take these photos. But in actuality, she never actually learned how to ride a horse. So, and she went everywhere in a buggy, or she walked with all her heavy photography equipment. So she would take a buggy as far as she could get to go take photographs like this one on the right with the mine. And then she would carry her photography equipment up the mountainside to take these pictures. So sometimes a shoot like this for a mine, a lot of them were promotional footage for the mines to send back to investors in the east or down in San Francisco. But a lot of these photo shoots would take her all day. She is also known for her, her skill in photography and her quality of photographs. So she would ride the cages down into the mines to take these pictures, like the one over here on the left. And, this required a lot of skill to get these photos. So she had to keep her flash powder and her flash bulbs dry. If they got damp, they wouldn't work. She had to set up tripods. She had to use long exposures, and she had to have proper lighting. And she still got incredibly high quality images. Regardless of that. That's something that even a professional photographer today would need to have the skills and the equipment and the know-how to get high quality images in that kind of a setting. So one of my favorite stories about Nellie that is in the Mining Town book was that the Stockbridge studio, after it moved to its new location in 1906, was located on the respectable side of Cedar Street. So if you know Wallace, one side of Cedar Street was the red light district, and the other side of Cedar Street was respectable businesses at the time. But the prostitutes from the red light district would come, and they were some of Nellie's best customers. They would have photographs taken to send back to family and friends, and they would also buy a lot of the little trinkets that she sold along with the photos in the gift shop to send home to family. So they spent money freely in her shops, and she never judged the women. But she was known to save her harsh judgment for customers who asked for special favors and credit. She was known to remark that the prostitutes were better behaved when it came to matters of unpaid bills than her supposedly respectable customers. So, we're going to move on. I just want to talk for a minute before we move into the then and now photos about using photography as a primary source. Because while photography is an incredibly useful primary source, and it's one of the best ones we have, as this quote says, photographs can describe the past. They have a limited capacity, however, to explain it, no matter how much we might wish that they could. So I think it's just really important to keep in mind when using photos as a primary source that they rarely tell the whole story of something. You know, photographers have a bias, even if they don't realize it, or they're not, you know, they're not actively showing their bias when they take the photos. You never know what they left off frame. So there could be something 2 feet out of frame that changes the entire story of a photo. So as we go through these photos, just remember that it's best to use photos in conjunction with other primary sources. So they describe the other primary sources we have rather than explain what is happening. I'm going to move into the then and now photos now. I have done then and now photos before, but I usually do them of ghost towns in Nevada. So it was proven here that it's harder in Idaho because trees grow a lot in 100 years. It makes the entire shape of the mountain and the hillside change. So it's kind of hard to find some of the photos. I usually stick primarily to landscape photos, but because of the trees and also private property, a lot of the photos that Nellie took of mines and stuff are on private property now, so they're not accessible for me to go and do then and now photos. So this whole project ended up being a little harder than I anticipated, which is why we mostly stuck to buildings within Wallace for these photos, as you'll see. But this first one was actually taken before Nellie came to town, so this would have been a Barnard photo. But it's one of my favorite spots on the river, so I had to do it anyways. This is a gentleman canoeing on the Coeur d'Alene River in 1897. So this is where Pritchard Creek meets the river, if you're familiar with the area. It's where you can park right there where you turn right to head up to Murray and walk down to the river, and that's exactly where this is. So here is my photo. You're gonna have to excuse the poor lighting on this one because it was October when I came up with this idea. And my brother and I were on our way home from Thompson Falls and stopped here, and I think my toes almost fell off crossing the river to get this photo. And so I wasn't willing to try again in better lighting, but it still proves the point. So you can see here, the most notable change in these pictures is the riverbank. So that's what 100 years of erosion and mining practices, you know, they weren't always the nicest in their mining practices, the most environmentally friendly, but that's what 100 years will do to the riverbank. Not a lot has changed though. I obviously wasn't at quite the right angle, so it's not lined up perfectly, but you can see right there in the middle of the mountain, the pointy rock formation. It's in both pictures. So, and then this is the same guy canoeing on the river. It's just facing the other direction. So it's turned around at the same spot. There's the modern picture. And then you can see here, pretty much what has changed is the shape of the riverbank. But more or less the same. Okay. So these ones I think are really interesting because we have multiple views from this spot, or multiple photos from the same spot. So we can look at, you know, a couple from history and then mine as well for this same view down 6th Street. This one, I learned that Nellie didn't have to deal with cars when she was taking hers because she's basically standing on the center of the universe, if you have been there. And every time I would get it just perfectly lined up, a car would come and I'd have to move. So Nellie didn't have to deal with traffic. But this is 6th Street in Wallace in 1896. One of the things to notice is the lack of trees on the hillside. I also want to point out the balcony on that furthest hotel down on the left-hand side of the road, because it is not there in 1905. So the first picture would have been taken by Barnard. It was 2 years before Nellie came to town, but this one would have been taken by Nellie. And it's the same view. There's slightly more trees on the hillside. The balcony is gone. I like the horse-drawn wagon in the picture. And then here is the modern photo.
The balcony's back.
The balcony is back. I worked at the Depot Museum in Wallace for a year before I came to the Museum of North Idaho. And I can't remember where I heard it or who told me, but I know they used historic photos to bring that balcony back and bring the building back to its original grandeur. So that was why I wanted to point that out. It was an important use for Nellie's photos to learn that that balcony did exist at one point in that building's history. But notice the trees grew back. So the biggest change that you'll notice through majority of these photos is the interstate. That is the big change in Wallace, but the interstate is also the reason why everything looks the same. So if you're not familiar with the story, when the Federal Highway Administration came to Wallace and they said, we want to build Interstate 90 through your town, here's our plan. The original plan had them wiping out a lot of the downtown businesses and buildings. So Wallace, as we know it, would have looked completely different today if that plan had gone through. But if there's anything we know about Wallace, it's that they don't like to be told what to do, and they don't take no for an answer. So some local citizens came together, and in 1979, they were able to list every downtown business on the National Register of Historic Places. So it's something like 42 buildings in their National Preservation District. And because they did that, federal dollars could no longer touch downtown Wallace. So because of that, the Federal Highway Administration was forced to redesign the interstate through Wallace, which is why it is up on the viaduct on stilts above town and no longer goes down through the middle of town like with their original plan. Wallace was actually, they held up this process so long because they're Wallace, that they were the last stoplight in 3,000 miles of Interstate 90 until 1991. So in true Wallace fashion, in 1991, they had a funeral for the final stoplight when they took it down. They had a horse-drawn hearse and pallbearers, the whole 9 yards. They put it in a casket and took it to its final resting place in the Wallace District Mining Museum, and it is still there today if you'd like to go visit the last stoplight. So just know as you look through these photos, the interstate is the major change that you'll see, but it's also the reason why nothing has changed in Wallace. Their historic preservation rules in the city are obviously working very well. So, see, this is the Shoshone County Courthouse. It was built in 1905 and completed in 1907. So that picture is the courthouse is a very new courthouse. This is the courthouse today. This is another one where cars kept getting in my way. And then here's the comparison. So the obvious comparison is the tree got bigger, and they painted the courthouse at some point in its history. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting as I looked through these photos and tried to find differences was that you can see a little bit of modernization in them, like the ramp on the right-hand side of the building that makes the building ADA accessible. So just little changes like that I thought were really interesting to take note of as I went through. This is the Press-Times office on Bank Street in the year 1900. So this over there on the left is the courthouse. So literally just stood where I was and turned the camera a little bit to take this picture from the last one. You can see the buildings in the back on the hillside. Here's the modern one. If you look really closely, there are some differences. The road going up the hillside is a little less steep and a little wider. You can see the historic stairs. If you guys have ever been to Wallace, the historic stairs are a big deal that they advertise there. People like to go climb the stairs and look at all the cool old houses on the hillside. So you can see those stairs in 1900 are still there today. Things haven't changed right down to some of the power poles you'll notice throughout these photos are in the same spot. But one thing I thought was really interesting is there's a house right behind the Press-Times office. You'll see it there, the green one in the modern picture. It's there in the old picture. And when I was reading that article about Nellie and the 1910 fire, it said that only one house on the hillside survived the fire. So I think it might be that house, but if anybody can confirm that, I'd love to know. Because that is the one that looks the same, but also the trees grew. So can't see a lot of the houses. Right, this is the Jameson Hotel in 1905. And they painted it. It's one of the big changes, the Jameson and the Suites Hotel. And then, there you go. In this one, you'll notice that pretty much everything is the same aside from the paint. The fire hydrant and the power pole are in the same spot. But this is another one where you notice the sidewalk is ADA accessible in the modern picture. So just little changes like that I thought were interesting. This is Bank Street, arguably one of the more recognizable buildings in Wallace. It's Rossi Insurance Building today in 1905. Here it is in 2024. and then the comparison. Still not a lot has changed. Let me find my, oh, I forgot to point out, this is why I made notes. One of my favorite parts of this photo is that you see over here on the right-hand side, there's a blurry person. It's one of my favorite things in old photos is you can see the movement of the people walking through them. And then it looks like there's a bicycle right on the edge too. But yeah, not a lot has changed. You can see down on the, about halfway down the white building, it's Wallace Brewing now. They have more decoration on the top than they did in 1900. But that's about it. Aside from the obvious. It is interesting, the courthouse, in the old picture, the courthouse isn't there. It hadn't been built yet. It was still 5 years from getting started. And so you can see the courthouse in the modern photo. So some things change in Wallace. This is Cedar Street in Wallace. If you're familiar with town, this building right here on the right is the Brooks Hotel now. They have fantastic pancakes if you're ever in town at breakfast time. But here we go. Again with the cars being in the way. Every time I've been to Wallace, there's been a car parked there. So people like to go to the Elks, I guess. And the comparison. So this is another one where you see the interstate is the big change. A few of the buildings are different, but the interstate is what, you know, it's reshaped that hillside there to put in the interstate, as you can see. And I also thought it was interesting, the Wallace Corner Hotel sign, the neon sign down at the very end of the street is there in both photos. They have had that one remade. It's not the original sign, but it's still cool that they've kept that up. This is the Providence Hospital. It was built in 1891. It did survive the 1910 fire. So I won't get into it today, but if you've heard the stories of the nuns trying to get people out of the fire and praying that everything would be safe, this is that hospital. And it was closed in 1968 due to aging facilities. My brain struggled with this one, not gonna lie. I know that's where the hospital was, but all the trees and everything just made this look very different. So, just a comparison. There is a staircase over here in the modern photo. You can see it if you look really closely. One thing I thought was interesting, you can see the railroad crossing sign in the old photo, and obviously the railroad no longer runs through the Silver Valley. So, this is the Holy Trinity Episcopal Church. This is the building that now houses the Barnard Stockbridge Photography Museum. So if you're really interested in this photography collection and in Nellie after this, they have an entire museum about her in town. It was built in 1910. Here's the modern photo. You'll see the big change here is they added an addition to the right-hand side of the church at some point. I'm not sure when that was added, but it was a house and now it's part of the church. This is today the North Idaho Trading Company building. I like how close that house is to it in the background. It looks like it's just gonna like fall off onto the building. Looks like it still might be that close behind the trees. So the big change here is they added an addition to this building as well, and they moved the staircase over. That historic staircase is still there. You can head up the stairs from there. It's just further over. And the trees grew. You can also see, I think it's the 60s or 70s where this happened to a lot of historic buildings. They made the windows smaller and they added, you know, the boards over the glass. And they kind of, I always say 1970s to them, but I'm not sure if that's the right decade. I had something else I wanted to say about this one. I know I did. Oh, the North Idaho Trading Company has a mermaid skeleton, a mummified mermaid inside if you ever want to go see that. It looks pretty realistic. This one was really fun because this is where you actually see a lot of change in Wallace. So this is 6th Street during a flood in 1906. You can see the Northern Pacific Depot in the background. And here it is today. This one was also kind of hard to line up. So I know I'm in the right spot, but I'm not sure I'm lined up right. So they moved the depot, yeah. And all of those buildings, Steve probably knows the answer to this, they collapsed at some point. The buildings were taken down and then they snow collapsed them and then the depot was moved to that spot. The what? Yeah. Yeah, so the depot, yeah, just like the J.C. White House. In 1986, as part of the interstate project, the depot was going to be in the way of the interstate because it used to sit just on the other side of the river where one of those big concrete columns is now. So it was only in the way by like 10 or 15 feet. But because it's on the National Register of Historic Places, instead of just tearing it down, the federal government had to move it 200 feet. They picked it up and they moved it across the river and set it in its current location. And then they also remodeled the entire thing. So it worked out really well for Wallace in the end. But the depot is probably the most iconic Wallace building today. So this one is the Wallace Public Library. It is honestly my favorite library. No offense to this one's wonderful too, but this library is just beautiful. You can see here some changes. The building next to it has been built and the interstate again in the background. And they redid the stairs at some point. This is the Wallace National Bank building. Most recently it was the U.S. Bank building, but the U.S. Bank is no longer there. This one I did not line up perfectly, but whoops, sorry. You can see not a lot has changed again. The building, it looks like to the back of the National Bank building is no longer wooden, so that did change. And then the building on the right-hand side has also changed since. And then this is my last one. This one I had to do because this is one of my favorite spots on the river. If you are familiar with the Silver Valley, this is the CCC Road in Cataldo. The Mennonite Church is up this road. And more often than not, you will see a moose up here in the summertime. So if you look closely in all the grass, this is my moose finding spot. So when I saw this in Nellie's collection, I had to go take the picture. But here's the modern one. So, unfortunately, the trees grew. The trees along the roadway are so thick and tall now that if I had stood where I think Nellie stood to take this picture, it would have been a tree and nothing else. So I stood down the riverbank a little bit, but you can see that the mountain lines up and that rock jutting out into the river is the same. The original picture said that it was taken just below the Cataldo Bridge. There is a big concrete something there, so I guess that was the old Cataldo Bridge, but now you see, the bridge you see is the old highway, so US Highway 10, and then the interstate bridges are behind it. They're getting ready to do a bunch of construction on those too, so this is probably not going to look this nice this summer. But, so now I want to talk a little bit about Nellie's legacy. Nellie lost the sight in one eye when she was over 80 years old. So she was still working when she was over 80 years old. She had never slowed down. Despite this, she kept working until shortly before her death at 97 years old. Nellie passed away on April 22nd, 1965. She is buried in the Coeur d'Alene Memorial Gardens Cemetery. That is the one out by Target. And she's actually on our cemetery tour for the museum the last 2 years. Colleen here in the front represented her for 2 years. So she's our local Nellie Stockbridge. But Nellie photographed Wallace in the Silver Valley by the time she passed away. She'd been photographing the area for 67 years, which is really incredible. She created a huge database of photos for us. But it wasn't unusual to find 3 generations of Silver Valley residents represented throughout her files. One time there was even 4 generations. So in an article in the newspaper, they were interviewing Nellie. The article said, Judge W.W. Woods, who sat on the bench here for over 20 years, had his portrait done by Miss Stockbridge. Later, she did his daughter's picture and then daughter's son, Martin Allen. The fourth generation portrait was then done by the same photographer when Martin Allen brought his small daughter Shelby from California to sit for Miss Nellie. So she was able to do all 4 generations of that family. Nellie said in that article that it was one of her most satisfying accomplishments. to be able to photograph 4 generations. Before she passed away, she was acknowledged as the world's oldest living member of the Zonta Club, which is an organization of business and professional women, which is pretty cool. There are a lot of articles about her being recognized for that in the papers. And when she passed away, all of her negatives were donated to the University of Idaho. So the Barnard Stockbridge collection at U of I, if you Google Barnard Stockbridge collection U of I, it pulls it up. You can search it by a timeline, you can search it by subject, you can search it by year. There's a ton of ways to search it, and there's a ton of cool photos. I highly recommend going through those. But they've pulled nearly 4,000 photos for the collection out of over 200,000 nitrocellulose and glass plate negatives that were taken by Nellie and Thomas Barnard during their time in the studio. So their collection spans from the years 1894, which is when Barnard's collection started, to when Nellie passed away in 1964. And like I said earlier, the quality of Nellie's images was incredible. So when this collection was donated to the University of Idaho, the Barnard Stockbridge Museum website says, when the University of Idaho digitizing unit leader first saw one of the collection images, a portrait expanded into a 36-inch by 48-inch print. His first reaction was total silence. Then he exclaimed, "Wow, I have never seen one of our digital images expanded to this size. I can count the individual hairs in his mustache." So, given what Nellie was working with, it's really incredible. This camera over here on the right-hand side was on display in the Barnard Stockbridge Museum, but I know it was on loan, so I'm not sure if it's still there. It's her 1903 Century portrait camera that she preferred in the studio long after she could have upgraded. She was taking portraits on that camera. So, in the Show News Press, in one of the articles that I read, it said, "Wallace may indeed be proud of this fine citizen who, though nearing the century mark, is still young at heart." Nellie never slowed down. It's well known that she kept working right up until she passed away. She was incredibly hardworking. Like I said, her collection can be searched at the U of I website or at the Barnard Stockbridge Museum. Her portrait collection is available to be searched there if you're interested in that. This little part here that I pulled out of her obituary I thought was interesting. It says, "Through most of her life, Miss Stockbridge had a keen but quiet and dry sense of humor that delighted those who knew her well. One day, a salesman, unacquainted with her, referred to her as Mrs. Stockbridge. She was quick to reply, 'It's Miss Stockbridge. I've been missed all my life.' She wasn't missed during her life, but she will be missed now. A part of Wallace died with her." So, she never married. She was just completely dedicated to her photography studio. But at the time of her death, Nellie's collection covered all but 15 years of the mining district's history. So I don't know if we can get across how incredible it is that we have this database of photos and record of Silver Valley history from Nellie. So I want to end with, this is the earliest photo of Wallace I found in her collection from 1887, and then the most recent photo of Wallace that I found. So because of Nellie, we have those photos. Oh, thank you.